Good morning, everybody. How are you all today? Hopefully they won't. I just heard some feedback in the mic. I apologize if I end up with some of that. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Great. Look at that, Brandon. You should be on.
Mic check.
Can you hear Brandon?
All right.
Yeah. Fantastic. Did everybody have fun at the reception last night? Were there folks that didn't make it in for the reception? Yeah? Oh. Daniel.
Well,
oh, fair enough. Oh, man, that's really bad. Let's see if that's any better. Okay, great. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Clare, Cady. I'm the founder and director of the College and University Food Bank Alliance.
My name is Brandon Matthews. I am the Associate Director of Campus Resources.
And we're really excited to be able to take time to talk with you all today. And if you all haven't noticed, there's a video camera in the back. They're actually recording this to be able to have it shown for folks that are doing the virtual ticket, which is pretty exciting. So just so you know, as we do questions later on, there is a microphone down front, and so we'll ask you to utilize that. And if you have mobility issues and you need to have the microphone brought to you, we will definitely do that. Is there anybody in the audience that is having issues or trouble hearing us? If you just raise your hand. Everybody can hear? Okay. Is there anybody who has any visual issues or needs any type of ability to be closer to read slides? Okay, great. So I just want to start by getting a sense of who's in the audience. Are you all hearing this feedback? Is there a way we can get some help on this? I don't. Just keep trying to move the microphone. Ooh. I think I might have figured it out. Okay, so I really want to get a sense of who is in the audience today. I do a lot of talks about campus food insecurity. I do a lot of talks about campus pantries. And I always get a really interesting group of folks that come in. So just to get started, I'd like for folks to raise your hand if you have a pantry on your campus. Okay. Ooh. Keep your hand up if you are the person that is primarily responsible for that pantry. Okay, so we've got a mix of folks for that. Raise your hand if your campus does any type of work in benefits access, so SNAP or WIC. Okay, fewer. Okay. Raise your hand if you have a food recovery program on your campus. Okay. How about like a community garden? Okay, great. So we've got folks from all different kinds of approaches. Raise your hand if you're here because you just really want to learn because you're interested in maybe getting something started. Okay. Raise your hand if you have something already but you want to start something else. Okay, great. Wow, we've got like a broad mix of everybody here today, which is really exciting to me. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon. He's going to talk a little bit about our learning outcomes.
Yeah, so there are really 4 objectives we want to look at today and hopefully get your feedback on some of that and hear about some of the programs, since so many of y'all are already doing things that we're probably going to talk about today. But of course, the first is looking at current research on student food insecurity, and that's something we don't want to spend too much time on. We can certainly get you all of that information, our literature review. But we also want to look at some of the impacts of food insecurity. When we look at a study we conducted last year, the Hunger on Campus report, I'm sure many of you have seen, as a collaboration with several great groups. But we wanted to look at some of the effects of food insecurity as it related to education, housing affordability, of course, food, and different poverty issues. And so we'll look at some of that survey data. And then we're also going to look at some of the promising practices or things that we thought are really beneficial where campus food pantries, community gardens, work with homeless students can all kind of intertwine to create a better environment for those individuals. And so that's what we hope to accomplish today.
So I just want to talk for a second here about the fact that we did do a study just recently. Last October, we released the Hunger on Campus study. It was a 4-organization collaboration, and and Brandon will talk a little bit more about the methodology. But I just want to talk a little bit about the climate in which we made the decision to do this study. So I started the work that I've been doing both with the Food Bank Alliance, but also just in addressing campus food insecurity in 2011 when I started working at Oregon State University. And I was the director of the Human Services Resource Center there, which was an office that was focused on poverty, hunger, homelessness, and addressing those for students at Oregon State. I had no idea what I was doing when I decided to take this position. I actually myself was unemployed and living in a car as a student affairs practitioner, and just had, the recession hit me hard. So I took this job, and really I didn't know exactly what was going on. I didn't know that this was an issue on campus. And on my first day at work, I'm standing in the campus pantry at Oregon State. The student coordinator is teaching me the USDA civil rights rules. And she's got this PowerPoint slides like printed out, and she's just holding them and flipping them, and she's talking to me. And all of this hustle and bustle is happening around me, and it hits me, oh my gosh, these are students. These are college students. I was a college student. These students are hungry, and they're on a campus pantry that was designed for them. And that's when it really sunk in. And this was my job, and it was just sinking in. So it's gotten a lot of attention since then. A lot of folks have been paying attention since then. It certainly wasn't on the radar in 2011. It really wasn't until about 2013 that it started to hit the media. And it started to hit the media because there were a lot of sort of sensational stories, but it also was because there were a number of smaller studies coming out. Individual schools like Western Oregon University were putting out studies and sort of starting to share this issue on campus, and the numbers were really staggering. And so around the time that some of these studies were coming out, I connected with my colleague, Nate Smith-Teig at Michigan State, and we founded this Food Bank Alliance. And the goal was just to connect people who were dealing with these issues, who were focusing on these issues, so that we could learn from each other. And what we found was when we opened the space, it wasn't so much like today where there's people raising their hands for all of these questions. We used to say, who has a pantry on their campus? And we'd have one person in the back who was like, woohoo! So the climate has been that our membership has increased 300% over the 4 years. And we've been in existence for 6. So just that amount of attention that this is getting is really exciting, but it's also really terrifying. There are national studies that are focused on this, but we still don't have anything that's representative. So the Wisconsin Hope Lab put out a study, and we've put out a study. There is a new study coming out this week, also from the Hope Lab, that are starting to build a picture of what's going on.
So kind of just to go over the methodology, I know you can read a lot of that, but as Claire said, while there's lacking national representation as it relates to research on this issue of food insecurity on college campuses, we found some very interesting results, or I should say information about 1,800 of the students. When we surveyed 34 campuses, we tried to get a wide variety: community colleges, large land-grant institutions, rural communities, urban, the whole gambit, the best that we could. We conducted most of that starting this time last year, actually. It's hard to believe.
Yeah.
3,700 responses you saw. But the information when we're looking at the schools that participated and then looking at our sample, I'll get to in a second, is actually pretty accurate to the schools we sampled. So we were excited to see that. And then we have, the demographics for, undergraduate students in a whole for the nation, and that's where the breakdown isn't quite as close. But I wanted to list the schools that we had here that are participating. If there's anybody here who's at one of these schools, thank you for being here. We're really excited. This wouldn't have been something we could do without you, so we just wanted to highlight their efforts. So you have our breakdown here. 57% of our survey sample was female. You can see that we sampled closely as far as people of color, except for African Americans and blacks. We're trying to isolate why that was the case with our sampling, but we tried to do the best we could to get an accurate representation there. But this is who's in the pudding, as you can read there, to kind of give us a look at who, at a top snapshot at that 30,000-foot level, who are we dealing with on those campuses. And so Claire will kind of start with our first observation. Yeah, so one of the things that the major thing that came out of the study was obviously that what we thought was happening is happening. It was a really good
opportunity for us to replicate the study that had happened at the Wisconsin Hope Lab. So we reached out to them. They gave us all of their methodology. We followed that as closely as we could. We included some additional questions around student experience because we wanted to take a deep dive into the students who were experiencing food insecurity, which we'll talk about in a minute. But that's the biggest observation we had was, hey, our numbers and the Wisconsin Hope Lab numbers line up. And almost every one of these single institutional studies that were out there fit within the ranges that we were finding. So we found that, 25% of students were experiencing some form of food insecurity with hunger. We had up to 40 that were experiencing it without hunger. And just to clarify what we mean by that, I think most people know what food insecurity with hunger means. You can kind of assume or, based off of the term. But when we talk about food insecurity without hunger, we're talking about people that maybe are reducing their caloric intake or maybe aren't eating nutritional food. So that whole stereotype of the student that lives off of ramen, which most people have probably heard, is the students that are experiencing food insecurity without hunger. So they're getting enough calories, but they're not eating something that's very good for their bodies, and certainly isn't going to be nourishing their minds in the way that they need to be successful. When it comes to housing insecurity, this is where we started to dive in on that 1,800 student sample that were experiencing food insecurity. So it was good to get and very validating to get those bigger numbers to find out like what percentage of students we studied or that we surveyed were experiencing food insecurity, but we really wanted to understand more about their experiences. So, we saw that students were experiencing difficulty paying for their mortgages or paying for their rents. We found that they were having a hard time paying the utility bills. We found that they were having to borrow money from their friends and their family, and some even were having to move multiple times because they maybe had housing, but they were housing insecure. And so we were seeing that, you would make that assumption or that leap that if you're dealing with an issue where you're not able to feed yourself, you're probably dealing with some additional issues. And we were finding that these students were experiencing that. We also found that students were experiencing homelessness. So we found that as many as 15% had experienced homelessness sometime over the course of the last year. And that's lining up with the national numbers that we're finding. Actually, the most stable number that we're seeing across all the literature right now is the homelessness figure. It's ranging from 13 to 15% in every study we've seen. So when we say, what we're assuming is happening when it comes to student homelessness, we are feeling very confident that that is the percentage of students that are experiencing homelessness on campus. Students are experiencing evictions. Some students are staying in shelters. Some students are experiencing situations where they're moving around a lot. There's a woman named Jessica Sutherland who runs an organization called Homeless to Higher Ed. I had the opportunity to see her speak last year at the Cal State University conference on food and housing insecurity. And she talked about how when she was a student, her family was like what they called bouncing around. So she didn't even think of herself as homeless. But that's sort of how she was defined. And so there are a lot of students that are on our campuses that maybe wouldn't call themselves homeless, but they are. They don't necessarily know where they're going to sleep that night. They're staying with friends. Their housing is really insecure. And so what we're seeing is that it's impacting students' ability to learn. So the students are missing classes. They're experiencing the inability to study. They're missing the ability to be engaged on campus. We know that if a student is more engaged beyond the classroom, that they're going to be more successful, they're more likely to persist. If a student has to work multiple jobs to bring in the money that they need, depending on what that job is, because we all know also that jobs could be engagement. Or that could be incredibly engaging for the student, but not all are, and some students are actually missing out on the opportunities that they could do with clubs and orgs and extracurriculars. And students were finding that this statistic, this 25% of students reported dropping a class. To me, that's a really significant thing to point out. So students may not be dropping out, but they are dropping classes. And so what does that mean? Well, what that means is the students put a lot of work into something and now they're not going to get the credit for it. It also means specifically if they've gone through a certain portion of the quarter or the semester that they've paid financial aid for that class and they're not going to get that back. So these are students who will max out on their aid more quickly, and they're the students that need the aid most. So to me, the fact that students are dropping classes, although obviously dropping out is a significant issue, I often find if students are just dropping classes to stay in school, that is a compromise that really can hurt them in the long run.
And so that leads us to our second observation, which is students are doing what they're supposed to do, and it's not cutting it. And this is probably the part of the study that rang home the most for me. Just quick testimony, when I was a senior at the University of Arkansas, I was actually utilizing the food pantry, but running it at the same time. I worked for it, and I love doing this. Has anybody rented a move from Blockbuster? Yeah, you guys remember Blockbuster? Or that's the thing, you remember it, but they're gone. Unless you go to Branson, Missouri, I think there's still one there. I saw it. Everything goes to live forever in Branson, I guess. But my senior year was kind of towards the end of the recession. And so for me, I lost that job security. The company tanked. So at that time, I was working. I was fortunate enough to pick up an internship that covered some of that cost, but didn't cover all of it. I debated whether or not I was going to have to drop classes. And there weren't a lot of options. But fortunately, we had a food pantry and I had a great mentor that told me about that so I could access that resource. And it helped me stay in school. I was able to subsidize my hunger needs without having to, give up rent or some of the other basic needs. There was no more going out to Dixon Street, if you guys know Arkansas, things like that. So let's kind of dive into that. Employment. In our survey, 56% of the students were working. We have it broken down here. And I wanted to note that 61% of these here were working anywhere from 10 to 30 hours. And I know there's a lot of literature and more saying, that threshold of what's going to make a student the most effective and efficient in their college years, and it's somewhere between 15 to 19 to 20 hours. That's a good amount of time to work while still being enrolled as a full-time student. But we're finding that there are, several students, what do we have here? 25% more than that, 35% or so that are working more than 20 hours a week. And so that could be, that can bring a whole lot of different challenges if they're having to look at reducing the amount of time they're studying or taking on a lighter class load, which ultimately means they'll be in school longer, which will cost them more. And so there's just a lot of compounding challenges there. We looked at meal plan use, and really specifically in this case at four-year institutions. We know that not all two-year institutions offer a meal plan. Some have a canteen or a student union that has a restaurant or something in there. But what we found was pretty interesting is that students experiencing food insecurity that were still using a meal plan. So what does that mean? You've got weekends, you've got holidays when the dorms aren't open or the housing's not open, so students have to leave, but they don't necessarily know where they're going to go. Of course, the campus dining hall shut down during those times. But something else interesting that we saw was how many meals students were eating. And if you look, consistently here, that those who have a meal plan that aren't food insecure were eating more meals. A lot traditionally, I know meal plans at the campus where I was at, you could buy 10 or 12 or an unlimited amount. And so some schools it works like that, some have all unlimited. But what we see is that, students facing food insecurity in a meal plan are skipping more meals, which is interesting because, there's the developing mindset that if a student has a meal plan, they have access to food. Well, yes, but no, not always. They don't always have that access. Looking at financial aid, 75% of the students reported receiving some type of financial aid, whether it was Pell Grants, and that's kind of interesting. Looking at the number here and then some of the information about what's happening with students and Pell Grant eligibility, it's just really fascinating. We'll get to that later. But you can see scholarships, student loans, private loans, all kinds of different sources. And then for kind of non-traditional senses of aid, we kind of have that broken down there, whether that's getting payments from parents or guardian or someone, or something that didn't fit into the realm here. But students are receiving financial aid, but it's still not enough to cover all their needs. They're not necessarily enrolled in receiving a full ride or whatever institution that. And it's not that it's just a four-year college and the cost is more. This is an issue at community colleges, 2-year, everything from certifications to finishing your bachelor's. So it's all over the board when you look at that.
Yeah, and I think that second observation also to me is a very significant one in the sense of, if you all are working on your campuses or in your communities and you are experiencing the naysayers, I work through school, so these students should do that, or maybe they should just get another job, or well, why aren't they using their financial aid? Why do they want a free ride? These types of very in my opinion, not thought through statements in terms of what the current climate is for students, like for today's student. It is great to be able to say, hey, look, here's the deal. The majority of these students are working. The majority of these students get aid. A lot of them have meal plans. Some of them even live on campus housing, and it's still not cutting it. A statistic that is really significant to me around financial aid is that for community college students, the Pell Grant used to cover 100% of tuition and additional living expenses. And now, on average, the Pell Grant is covering 60% of tuition only. And that's at community colleges. So when we think about the buying power of the Pell Grant versus the cost of school, it's not surprising that this is what's happening. But if you were me, I was a Pell Grant recipient. Pell Grant was really significant and important to me in making it through school, and that Pell refund was what helped me to live when I was in school. I wouldn't be receiving that today. I'm not even sure I would qualify for a Pell Grant today. And I didn't go to school that long ago. So if you think about some of the people, like for me, I talk a lot of times to college administrators who are kind of saying, this is not necessarily something that we need to be thinking about on campus, and maybe these students aren't managing their money well, or kind of coming at it from a deficiency mindset. To be able to point to this information, another great resource is the book Paying the Price, which is by Sarah Goldrick-Rab. It came out last fall, and she talks about the impact of financial aid, and she talks about financial aid policy and how financial aid is no longer serving students the way it used to. Our third observation is that there is a lot of room in already existing interventions to support students. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that when we asked students what services they were utilizing, we were actually finding low rates of utilization of services beyond financial aid. And so we found that, 61% of students were using something, but a lot of them weren't necessarily using the things that are going to have the most impact. And some of that is because of the student maybe not knowing about it or how to get it, but some of it is also because it's challenging to get. So that first, it's 25% of students utilizing SNAP. Well, it's really hard to get SNAP when you're a student. How many of you have helped a student try and apply for SNAP? Okay. So if you spend time trying to help students apply for SNAP, you know that students have to be working 20 hours a week, or they have to have federal work study. How many of you have seen a decrease in federal work study opportunities on your campus? Yeah, it's pretty common at this point. So it's challenging for students to get that. How many of you have campuses that have a cap on student work on campus that puts them under 20 hours a week? Yeah, lots of you. So students have to take jobs off campus if they want to try and qualify for SNAP, and they don't have federal work study. And it's harder and harder to get federal work study. We do also see that students are utilizing the campus food pantries when there is a campus pantry. Not every school in our study had a campus pantry, but it's still a really low percentage. 17% of students are utilizing that campus pantry. To me, that could be for a number of reasons. We didn't ask students why they were or weren't using certain services, but I do think what this list says to me is there's a lot of space to create a lot of interventions to serve your students. So if you don't have someone on campus that helps students navigate SNAP or WIC, that might be something to think about, for example. Because obviously, although yes, it's challenging to do, A lot of students probably can do it, but aren't. And it's the same with campus pantries and other interventions. So when we think about the ways to promote food insecurity, I kind of warmed up this slide already by asking some questions at the start. But obviously, we're the College and University Food Bank Alliance. We help people start food pantries on campus. Although we did just recently rescope our mission to include additional food insecurity initiatives. We recognize that a campus pantry is generally, for a lot of schools, step one. And we are starting to see, when we're doing workshops and panels, that a lot more folks are coming in that are raising their hand and saying we already have something and we want to do more. Because when you open a space and the students come in, you don't just give them food, you get their stories. And when you get their stories, you realize that campus pantries are great for that immediate intervention. But it can, if you just stop there, be like slapping a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. And so you have to think about more long-term solutions. So partnering across campus to increase food streams is really powerful. So food recovery programs are really, really helpful. Dining center meal donations. How many of you have heard of Swipe Out Hunger? Okay. Swipe Out Hunger is a national nonprofit. They actually start chapters on college campuses, and they make it possible for students to donate dining dollars by swiping and giving that to the program. Some schools move that money off campus, and some schools keep that money on campus, and some do a little bit of both. But it is a great partnership. The opportunity to, as I keep saying, help students get SNAP, and also to have students be able to use SNAP on campus, which let me tell you, that's really hard to do. But if you're able to do it, it makes a huge difference for students. But if you can find somebody or many somebodies on campus who are able to help students navigate through that benefits access space so that they can get SNAP, it's great because you can get them that food box every once in a while if they're in an emergency. But if you can get them a SNAP eligibility, if you can get them enrolled, then they get money every month. So it's a long-term solution plan. There are some students that don't want to do that. I've had plenty of students be like, no, that's not for me. And then I ask them, well, do you get financial aid? Because this is another form of that. I know you don't see it that way. It's a much more stigmatized version of this. But if we want to be real, financial aid is another federal subsidy to help people get through and to be successful. I saw some hands for community gardens. That is a great way to grow food on campus, and then you can donate it to the campus pantry. At Oregon State, we had a program called Growing Food Security. It was the sustainability initiative and my campus pantry, and they actually grew a lot of their summer produce and a lot of the fall produce for students that was given out at the pantry came straight out of that. And then lastly, partnerships with farmers markets can be fantastic for a couple of reasons. First off, a lot of farmers markets will do a cash match for SNAP. So if a student's receiving SNAP, they can go to the farmer's market and they can double their money to shop at the farmer's market by using their SNAP dollars. The other is that a lot of times farmer's markets, at the end of a market, the farmer's market coordinators can ask the folks that are there, maybe would you be willing to donate some of the produce you didn't sell today? And so that was something that we did at OSU, was we would actually drive to the farmer's market and just pick up excess produce at the end and take it to students. In terms of housing insecurity, so as I said, homelessness, that's the statistic that has stayed the most stable in all of our studies. The idea that a student might be homeless chronically is one thing, and addressing that is different than if you have a student who is sort of more temporarily homeless. But if you have residence halls on campus, most housing programs will have emergency spaces set aside and available. And that's for a lot of different reasons. Maybe there's a dispute between two roommates where somebody needs to be moved really quickly at 2 a.m. I worked in college housing. I definitely had to handle some situations like that. Or maybe there is a flood in a room. Somebody decided to put their coat hanger on the sprinkler system, which is terrifying when that happens. So there may be need to move students into those emergency spaces. If you can broker a partnership to be able to utilize those emergency spaces if they are available for students experiencing homelessness, that can be a great short-term solution to then do some case management with that student to move them forward. Also reaching out to local hotels to get vouchers. So that's actually something that a lot of domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters will do. So if you were to choose to do that, it probably would be good to ask any hotel that you might ask if they're already doing that, because you don't want to take away from another local agency. Helping students apply for HUD. Again, really challenging to have students receive Section 8, but if there's a way to have them connect with people that can help them through that process, that can go a long way for students, particularly students with children. And then developing partnerships with local officials. So when I worked at Oregon State, had a fantastic partnership with our code enforcer in town, because we would see students that would, 10 students in a four bedroom or a 3-bedroom or a 2-bedroom because they couldn't afford rent. And when those types of code violations are happening, and the city would have to go in and have some of those students move out, they actually called me. So I could be on site and be available to help those students to transfer into a temporary situation while we helped them figure out how to get more stable housing. And then, there are opportunities to partner with homeless shelters. UCLA actually has a homeless shelter that's a part of their campus, but there's also the ability to partner with homeless shelters, particularly ones that are helping people to raise out of homelessness by doing certain requirements. If you can get a local homeless shelter to support a student while they're completing a degree, and they can stay as long as their GPA is a certain level or whatever that happens to be, it can be a great way to create stability for that student.
In terms of promoting college affordability, a lot of what we looked at aren't necessarily federal programs, although when we get to improving access to benefit programs, it kind of comes in there, but emergency grants. So several of the schools we're working with, and some that in our research we looked at, Bunker Hill, Cooney, all these schools have emergency grant programs that are either funded by institutional dollars, so it's coming from within the institution, or they've applied for grant funding of some sort to help students in these situations. So whether that's something they can use for housing, a utility need, food, all of the different areas that we're looking at, they can apply there. Completion grants, you might have heard them called gap grants or retention grants. This is what Claire was talking about, students having to drop classes or unenroll. This is a resource that basically if a student is showing genuine financial hardship, they're on track to graduate, they're in a degree plan, they're basically almost on the home stretch, they're in their last semester, last year, they can be eligible for this resource. And I don't know that there are a lot of schools doing this, but this is a great way to ensure that those students who have committed 3.5 years of their life, or if they're at a community college, 1.5 years or whatever it is to complete their program, they don't have to drop out. I mean, that was a concern that I had when I was in school. Do I have to stop, work for several years, and then come back and try to pick up my degree? So that could be a great resource. Several slides back, we saw all these different forms of aid that students can access, and some are accessing, but with the percentages around 4, 5, 6%. A lot of these things students don't know about, even for whether or not they're eligible for SNAP, WIC, or the food pantries. I mean, that we've got over 450 schools we're working with. The majority of those have a functioning campus food pantry, yet students still don't know about it, or there's only, they've been open for several months and there's only, a handful, a dozen students accessing that resource. So finding ways to get that information out to the general campus community, whether it's some schools have utilized public service announcements, they've worked with their marketing communication department to run ads at community events, sporting programs, displaying that information in the health center on campus if there's one, or the student union running on the board, just whatever. I mean, everything from flyers to, an online database that says, here are the resources you can access. It's important to make sure students know it's there. If they don't know it's there, no matter how great that program is, if they're not accessing it, it's a moot point, really. In terms of lowering cost of textbooks, this is kind of two looks at this here. One, of course, is the book scholarships. I know, personal experience, my wife she studied chemical engineering, and I think she spent $600 on like a fluid dynamic book. And that was just one book, and she had, dozens more throughout her course. But books can be expensive. It's a cost that we don't necessarily think about, if a student's paying for, well, we do, I guess, knowing the audience here. But on the other side of that, students having to spend $1,200 in books or several $100s to have those for their classes, that can add up. I mean, that's taken away from a food budget. If you're spending $50 a week, which is conservative but kind of average, for that $200 to $300 a month in food, that's half your semester there. It could be that you took out of your food budget for that. So putting in perspective like that, you really see that while these programs maybe sound small, it can be largely impactful for that student. And of course, there's open sourcing or loaner programs where students can donate that book back to another student who's going to be in the same program. I can't think of how many books Elizabeth and my wife, just donated from college because we thought we were going to use them, and some of which are actually still active. Granted, books turn over sometime, but in a lot of cases, there's still life in that book. It's still relevant to that class. Another student can benefit from it if you're not using it. So in terms of college affordability, whether it's granting, textbooks, there are a lot of unique things going on. And that leads us to overall policy recommendations. These are kind of all over the board. We talked about, access to FAFSA, simplifying that process. It's a really daunting program. There's something like up to almost 140 questions. That's ranging from, what are your parents, your guardians making? What's your income status? Housing situation, all kinds of information, and some of which maybe if we look at and reevaluate, what is the use? I mentioned students and Pell Grant eligibility. Research out there shows that almost 2 million students who are Pell Grant eligible aren't receiving that funding. And part of that is they're not completing the FAFSA, or they don't know that the FAFSA is going to lead them towards that. And so when you leave that many students out there with a resource that they don't have to pay back, it's not a 10-year loan or whatever it is on their education, that's a big deal. Adding food insecurity measures to the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, it's a mouthful. It's really unique. This study looks at how students are spending their money and how they're affording college. And so when we look at the rates of food insecurity being 20% higher than what it is nationally, looking at around 15% for the nation, that's a big deal, and that's something we should be looking at nationally as it relates to students. Because if they're dealing with higher rates of that, then I think it's worth considering that's an area they're going to be sacrificing or they're going to be struggling. Of course, expanding SNAP eligibility requirements to students, I think Clare hit on that kind of. But looking at what does that mean? Is that counting full-time hours or school hours towards that working? Is that a matter of reducing the amount of hours a student has to work, or creating a whole new guideline that's specific to students? If there's one thing that's guaranteed, when it comes to federal assistance for students, it's a very temporary thing. There's a stigma of, you've got people abusing welfare and WIC and things like that, and they're just going to be a welfare queen or whatever. Well, students are in and out. If you let them get in and out in 4 years, they're done, and it's that program's they're on to the next thing. They're able to have good careers, hopefully, provide for their families, and they're out of that school age. So that's one area that we finding really interesting, looking at how can we do that. Improving the aid process for homeless students. So many students don't want to necessarily say that they're homeless, so they may skip filling out this information, or it's hard to pinpoint. If you don't have a home, where do we send records? How do we... It's hard to verify that housing situation when you don't have a housing situation. You're couch surfing if you're fortunate enough to do that. This legislation for match grant funding, this was something that came out of Arkansas, where I'm from. We had legislators looking at providing matching campus food pantry grants to colleges in the state. I think it was up to $5,000. And so the school would match that, or they would get the funding, whether it's through a grant or something. and the legislators would provide the rest. We've ran into some hiccups with that, but I think it's an interesting idea. And for Arkansas to be a trailblazer, y'all, I mean, that's scary. Okay, we have all of our teeth. It's a great state. I love it. All those terrible stereotypes, but this is something that I think if other states that have been trailblazers, other institutions, I think we can get some headway there. Looking at how do we, again, if we're looking at federal funding or state funding to support students, how can we access that here? And then, of course, the one that's probably, it maybe seems so simple but so difficult to do is expanding the National School Lunch Program. Basically, students who show financial need, when you're looking at them filling out the FAFSA, they're Pell Grant eligible, so many of those things are easy to identify and look at their financial situation and see, okay, maybe they could apply for reduced or free lunch program on our college campus, which the school's still getting the money for that, the dining services, but the students getting that food, that's one less thing they have to worry about if they're coming from a place of poverty or their low income status.
So we have about 10 minutes left. We want to open it up for questions. Because we are being recorded today, if you have the ability to come to the microphone and ask the question so it can be heard. If you choose not to do that, we will repeat the question. But we'd love for folks, if they have questions, to come forward.
Hi there. Thank you so much for sharing. I oversee the undocumented student program at UCLA, and as you know, our undocumented students don't have access to federal financial aid. They don't qualify for SNAP. They don't qualify for many federal opportunities. So I'm wondering if you looked, or in your survey, you included a question about immigration status or isolated immigration status, and if you did, if you can share what we could be doing to support them in this food security crisis that we're experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you for the question and for the work you do. It's really important. Because of the sensitivity around the question, we chose not to ask it, which was a challenging thing. We want to capture this data, but we don't want to make answering it a barrier to completing the survey. I have a lot of personal experience working with undocumented students. I was a mentor in the College Assistant Migrant Program when I was up in Oregon. And I worked with a lot of students who were undocumented, and we spent a lot of time helping them figure out how to navigate what is available to them. I wish I could give you a statistic, but I will say that the campus pantry can be a tremendous safe space. And if you do you have a pantry on your campus? Do you work with them, or do you have any connection with them? I recommend reaching out to them and seeing if they're willing to, regardless of what their rules or guidelines are, maybe look at creating a program that increases access for undocumented students because they are more likely to be in challenging financial situations. Yeah.
Don't be shy.
Morning. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Daniel. I work at UC San Diego in the Raza Resource Centro, and I was wondering, you mentioned that you all partner with about 450 different college campuses throughout the country, and you also talked about the idea of stigma at a few different times throughout, and so that's one of just in conversations with scholars on campus who have not utilized or done that outreach to the program, that stigma that is there, what it means for them to utilize it. And so I'm wondering, in your work, if you've seen any sort of, whether it's campaigns, I don't know if it's marketing campaigns, if it's a lot of one-on-one work with scholars, referrals to get them there, have you seen or heard anything in regards to what it looks like to really decrease that stigma on campus, whether it's using signing folks up for SNAP, CalFresh would be something that would be on our campus, or just utilizing campus food pantries that are there, since that's statistically 16% or so are utilizing it. Yeah. How do we kind of decrease that stigma? Thanks.
Well, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the experience at my undergraduate in the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. Fortunately, we had the backing of our chancellor That would not have been so if it wasn't for his wife being passionate about this issue. But that helped us get a lot of momentum in the early stages on getting other campus organizations involved, whether it was like the journalism, marketing, communication departments, the School of Business to kind of help us work through the plans. And so when we finally opened a year later, we had partnered with, we had a retailer on campus that donated bags, kind of a simple thing there. So when students went to the food pantry, they got the bags from the retailer on campus or the bookstore if we got those donated. So if you're walking around with that, that doesn't look suspicious at all if you have that. Not all campuses have that, though I guess most have a bookstore or something close to that. That was one way to physically reduce the stigma. But making those announcements, whether it's at sporting events or, alternative weekend opportunities, whatever the case may be, whatever your campus has, that was a huge piece in getting students to access it. I mean, I think in our first 6 months, there were probably about 15 students or so. And at the end of that, in another 6 months, we had about 100. And then when I took over leading that as a student intern, we had about 250 individuals using it each week. And now it's somewhere around 350 normally. And then it's up higher during the course of holidays or school breaks, like spring break. In the summer, it drops some because there's not as many students there. But those are kind of two ways that stigma has been reduced, or we can kind of make it a safe space for students. Part of that is, a lot of pantries operate on a model of, grab what you need when you need it. They're not all, checking IDs or whatever, or trying to verify who's using the pantry, and that's one way that's worked well for students. The question then that we usually get is, well, how do you make sure people aren't stealing the food? Well, I happen to work in the food banking industry, work with a Feeding America food bank, and, when our donors say things like that, we ask them, how eager are you to stand in line at a food pantry with, 150 other people waiting to get that? There are not a lot of people doing that. But then the reports of fraud and abuse are slim to none. I mean, we rarely hear that in our network, and we're listening. We want people to let us know so we can look at that. So I think just making it easy to access, getting that buy-in on campus. We were fortunate enough to have a large Greek life that got behind the opportunity. It was a way for them to unite. Our sports teams, the athletes got behind the issue, to which some, that's another piece that we didn't touch on, student athletes who needed to use that resource couldn't use our campus food pantry because of some, I guess, NCAA rules. And so we've got students who are, athletes and trying to access the food pantry, and we had to turn them away at the time and try to find an alternative resource for them. So, I mean, that's just another, conflict in itself. But Clare, do you have anything to add?
I'll add a couple of additional things. One is that, and I actually heard this from the GW Pantry, which opened just recently, they call it the store because they want students to be able to say, like, I'm going to the store, and have it be true. So some folks, they go the route of, we're going to call it the campus pantry because we want to destigmatize that by making it totally okay to go to the campus pantry. Other folks may choose different language around what it is they call their program. At RIT, they call it the food share. So again, it's about trying to have the language not necessarily boldly state what it is. In California, one of the coolest things I've seen to reduce stigma and shame is at CSU Humboldt State. They have a program called Oh Snap. And they actually, and you have to say it like that, by the way. And so they actually, right as soon as students arrive on campus, message to them about how important a resource CalFresh could be to them. And encourage them to see if they're eligible, help them to apply for it, and the culture shift on campus around receiving that assistance is such that when I was on the campus in the dining center, I heard a student ask another student out loud in the middle of the space, hey, did you get SNAP yet? So, that normalization of that has been as a result of that campaign. So there are ways to do it, but I think The biggest thing is to just recognize that there is stigma and to think through that based off of campus culture. At Humboldt, different political climate than maybe Fayetteville or Arkansas, certainly different than Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live. So, that also has something to do with it. We are out of time. We just want to say thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate your attention, and we'll be here for a few minutes if people have individual questions. So thank you so much.